Hi everyone, welcome to my report on the issues and challenges surrounding CSR communication. In this presentation, we will look at the problems that practitioners grapple with in their day-to-day, from strategy to implementation to monitoring and evaluation. CSR communication is a fairly novel implementation of communication traditions, theories, and strategies towards supporting broader CSR goals for organizations. While modern iterations of business started taking form in the 17th century, CSR as a concept did not arise until 300 years later in the 1950s, putting it in a position of perpetual catch-up with the idea of business itself in terms of maturity. Similarly, CSR communication is not as well researched or well practiced as other forms of organizational communication, such as marketing and advertising, and is therefore still relatively in a nascent state. This means that currently, we are in the middle of discovering what works and what doesn't, borrowing from the tenets of communication, sociology, psychology, and political theory to jerry-rig a half-decent measure that could offer a semblance of positive outcome in our CSR undertakings. In our quest to better understand the nuance of CSR communication compared to other disciplines within the communication umbrella, we are beginning to uncover fundamental challenges such as conflicting ideas surrounding its effective practice. One study might say corporate reputation precedes communication effectiveness, while another might emphasize that credible communication, which in itself is subject to measures of effectiveness, leads to corporate legitimacy, a dimension of reputation. In another example, independent sources are seen as more credible, all the while audiences prefer to receive communication directly from organizations, thereby undermining efforts to use third parties for messages that may never reach customers. Paradigmatically speaking, functionalist and constructivist approaches remain at odds today as to how to best think of and apply CSR communication. Even the definition of effective as it stands has not been clearly established, according to Crane and Gloser. This type of ontological discord is one thing, but it is perhaps inductive or even precipitating of the more direct issues that practitioners face in the conduct of their profession. We may be years or even decades away from reconciling these ideas into one cohesive, sensible body of knowledge, and until then, praxis will continue to inform our theoretical understanding of CSR communication. Operationally speaking, CSR communicators often deal with internal and external conditions that prove inhibitive to the success of the messaging program and the CSR initiative itself. Let's take a look. Internal challenges are those that are present in the organization and therefore can be addressed. However, that something is fixable doesn't mean it is easy or practicable to fix, or that there even is a suitable solution that exists just yet. Internal issues are something that is within the company's control, but internality does not necessarily equate to the company knowing exactly how to directly address or circumnavigate them. Of these, quite a few point to differing ideas as to what CSR communication is supposed to be and do, how little or how much, and what possibilities lie in its practice. For instance, CSR communication, like its siblings, is often viewed tactically, situated downstream from CSR rather than a critical element that informs, articulates, and aligns corporate responsibility measures with social expectations. Instead of being used as a conduit, an additional channel to sit at the table with audiences on very specific corporate citizenship issues, it is perceived as yet another outlet that pumps out brand-building literature. This is a very narrow understanding of the outcomes that are possible with the effective leveraging of the communication process, not too dissimilar to riding a bike with one wheel and half a handlebar. Such an issue stems from the broader conflict between functionalist and constructivist perspectives on CSR communication. In the same vein, CSR communication is sometimes viewed as serving a promotional purpose rather than an honest reporting mechanism to satisfy implicit and explicit social and legal contracts with various stakeholders, such as consumers and government agencies. There is this perception that it's a nice to have, rather than a critical process that is as important to the business as any other function. More organizations need to see CSR communication as a compliance measure, perhaps not in the technical sense of providing documentation and submitting to regulatory audits, but in the broader sense, which is complying with the will of stakeholders using accurate reporting of pertinent corporate activities. In a guest editorial for the Journal of Marketing Communications, Podner noted the argument for this subtle form of CSR communication, focused on informing rather than persuading, as being perceived as more appropriate for CSR than campaigns that overtly aim to change consumer attitudes. It is important to note, however, that such reporting is not subjected to audits and therefore are effectively positive messages, as organizations are not forced to tell the truth. Another challenge with CSR communication is attitudinal in nature, surrounding the support of leadership and the buy-in of the broader workforce. When it is viewed as an isolated function driven by marketing or communication, sometimes even HR, employees feel a sense of detachment, limiting support and positive outcomes for any CSR initiatives. Not only that, CSR programs without internal support suffer from perception challenges as well. Without employee commitment, CSR communication is perceived as pure managerial rhetoric. For employees particularly, cause company fit of CSR engagement, which is how a company appears to be the right organization in the right industry to tackle specific issues, has the highest impact on effectiveness. Similarly, without executive buy-in, communicating CSR may prove difficult as practitioners grapple with limited resources in terms of time, labor, and funding. And among those who are directly involved in the profession, it can sometimes feel like communication for communication's sake. This question is often around what to communicate, as though it is assumed that there's always something to communicate, not around whether or not there is something noteworthy to engage stakeholders with in the first place. It is tantamount to doing the work because it is expected, without fully understanding the rationale behind why it is expected. As more and more applied skills are required and mastered, the imperative to ask basic questions gets lost in the blur of daily operations. In fact, Miller and Fike found that communication employees perceive CSR as obligatory, rarely questioned or explained, labeled as voluntold, and primarily leveraged for good press. A finding by Cope has also revealed that there is a performative dimension to CSR communication, for which this operationally motivated approach by professionals is partly to blame. External challenges in CSR communication refer to the broader industry, socioeconomic and political environments that are not within the control of the corporations. These mostly pertain to public perceptions and obstacles that may inhibit the effectiveness of a CSR messaging program. Such issues are much harder to address because there is no direct way for any corporation to do so. Instead, organizations can only help navigate or steer social, economic, and political tides by communicating with consistency. Perhaps one of the most fundamental challenges in CSR communication is the matter of legitimacy itself, and the stakeholder skepticism that determines it. The problem with legitimacy, and in turn authenticity, is that the perception resides within external stakeholders and is therefore outside of the direct control of corporations. Existing literature may have identified a number of mediating and moderating factors, but legitimacy is still firmly placed as a function of a company's image rather than its identity. There are certain approaches to mitigating skepticism. However, it is largely dependent on broader issues, such as public perceptions on critical issues like workers' rights, the environment, and social causes, as well as the perceived role of corporations in supporting or undermining them. skepticism is uneven across geographical markets and cultures, depending on the ideals that people value within a given cultural territory. In terms of identifying the antecedents for skepticism, Nguyen et al. Have considered factors such as demographics and psychographics, corporate related dimensions, and macro environment factors. Awareness of critical social and environmental issues is a key contributor to growing skepticism in corporate citizenship, as it raises social expectations. Certain industries face more skepticism than others, although the sentiment is elevated across the board as people receive higher exposure to ideas that challenge the status quo. With more media examining the harmful effects of oil and gas, fashion, and overall unfettered hyper-consumerism, audiences are becoming increasingly attuned to the active role that corporations play in environmental decline in the pursuit of profit. For instance, Buy Now, The Shopping Conspiracy, Netflix's most recent documentary, investigates the playbook businesses deploy to deflect meaningful conversations about their unsustainable practices that are ultimately detrimental to our ecology. The production reframes greenwashing in a whole new light, underscoring the deliberate nature of the practice by accusing corporations of lying to consumers and controlling the narrative in order to protect their reputation and de-risk their bottom line. Consumers also hold mental models of cause-company fit, which is primarily internally decided and very difficult to measure. And this is critical because studies have found that the fit is predictive of consumer skepticism. Audiences often ask, why is your company tackling this issue specifically? And why do you feel you are the best to take this on? These are multi-layered questions because they investigate not only if a company is equipped to address a particular issue and if it is appropriate for them to do so, but also whether their motives are seemingly altruistic or egoistic. For example, when companies like H&M tackle sustainability issues in fashion manufacturing with a self-aware message, is it reflective of a genuine recognition of their role in harming the environment, or is it strategic in their pursuit to persuade consumers of their good intentions? These questions are very hard to objectively answer, both on the side of the stakeholder and the corporation, and therefore remain a major challenge that poses to undermine legitimate CSR communication. And that brings us to the end of the presentation. For our discussion, I'd like to propose the following points to start. First, do you have a CSR communication program in your company? And if so, which of these challenges do you see in your day-to-day? And second, do you think it is a moot point to pursue corporate legitimacy given that the odds are stacked against enterprise? Thanks again for watching. I look forward to interacting with you all in the discussion forum.